What's going on YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is Detective McGruff with the Tamari Police Department back at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind, this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. Alright, so get this, we're diving deep into the life of Jeff Fort today. Jeff Fort's story is one of ambition and the intertwining of politics, community and crime. While some view him as a symbol of resilience and leadership in marginalized communities, others see him as a figure whose actions exacerbated violence and corruption in Chicago. His legacy remains controversial, embodying the complexities of power and influence in urban America. Jeff Fort's story is wild. It goes from the streets of Chicago all the way to a supermax prison. You've got a whole bunch of articles and court documents, and they paint a picture of someone who was a powerful gang leader accused of terrorism. What strikes me is how Fort's story really reflects some of the biggest changes that happened in America during his lifetime. You know, the civil rights movement, the so-called war on drugs, even our relationships with other countries. Like, it'd be easy to just label him a gangster and move on, but what about the COINTELPRO and the bloody oath of the Jesuits? I think his life raises some bigger questions about the society that humans live in. Now, as we go over Jeff Fort's story, keep in mind, Jeff Fort, Chief Angel Bay, is Big Mama's rook. A rook can refer to either a large black bird from the crow family, Corvus frugulagus, or, in the context of chess, a chess piece that moves horizontally or vertically any number of squares. So a rook is Blackbird clan. In chess, a rook, also known as a castle, is a powerful piece that can move any number of squares horizontally or vertically, but not diagonally, and cannot jump over other pieces. Rooks move in straight lines, either horizontally, side to side, or vertically, up and down. Rooks capture enemy pieces by moving to the square, occupied by the piece. Each player starts the game with two rooks, one in each corner of their side of the board. Big Mama's two rooks were Big Tookie Williams Blue House and Jeff Fort Red House. Rooks are considered major pieces and are valued at 5 points, making them more valuable than pawns, knights and bishops, but less valuable than the queen, Big Mama. Rooks, along with the king, participate in a special move called castling. The rook's name comes from the Persian word Rukh, meaning chariot. In the original Indian game of Chaturanga, the rook represented a chariot, reflecting its swift and powerful movement. Rooks are considered heavy or major pieces along with the queen because they can checkmate the opponent's king with the help of their own king. In some European languages, the rook is called a tower or castle, reflecting its visual representation. Rooks represent strength and stability. They form the backbone of defensive and offensive maneuvers. Pawn. Pawns at the forefront of the battle symbolize resilience and progress. Under FIDE rules, a player may stop the clocks and summon the arbiter to provide a piece for promotion. Under US Chess Federation rules and in casual play, an upside-down rook may designate a queen. In spiritual traditions, rooks are often seen as messengers from the spiritual realm, conveying secrets and hidden knowledge, and are associated with intelligence, community, transformation, and spiritual guidance. Rooks are believed to be messengers from the spiritual realm, carrying messages from ancestors or the divine. As totem animals, rooks are seen as powerful guides, and those connected to the rook totem are likely to have a deep connection with their community and a desire to protect those around them. Intelligence and wisdom. The rook's intelligence and problem-solving skills are also seen as valuable spiritual qualities, transformation and change. Rooks are associated with embracing change and transformation, guiding individuals through life's transitions with grace and wisdom. Folklore and superstitions. In folklore, rooks are sometimes portrayed as bad omens associated with death or trickery. Okay, so let's start unpacking all of this. The sources start with his early life. Jeff Fort was the second of 10 children born to John Fort and Annie Fort Bacon in Aberdeen, Mississippi. He moved with his family to the Woodlawn neighborhood on Chicago's South Side in 1955. As a kid, pretty familiar story for a lot of families back then. He dropped out of Hyde Park High School after the 9th grade. Fort spent time at Cook County Temporary Juvenile Detention Center and at the Illinois State Training School for Boys in St. Charles, where he met Eugene Bull Hairston, also known as Chief Bull. The story of the Blackstone Rangers starts right there. You know, it's crucial to understand the context here. We're talking about Chicago. In the late 50s, early 60s, neighborhoods were often segregated, and for young black men, especially gangs, offered a sense of protection and community. In order for you to overstand Jeff Fort's situation, let me give you some history so that you can make the connections. They were facing discrimination and very few opportunities and opposition by the COINTELPRO. The Blackstone Rangers started out as a way to kind of defend themselves, like protecting their territory in the Woodlawn neighborhood. Members of the Black Pea Stone Nation, BPSN, founded in 1959 in or near Woodlawn. Their colors, or black and red. Their primary ethnicities group is so-called African Americans. Their symbols are the pyramid 7, sun and eye. The pyramid with the 21 bricks and a number 7 in the sun behind the point of the pyramid, eye behind the pyramid. The Black Pea Stone Nation ride under the 5-pointed star, which means they are therefore brothers or people. The BPSN was first known as the Blackstone Rangers Gang. In the Blackstone Rangers there were 2 gang leaders, Jeff Fort and Eugene Bull Hairston, aka King Bull and Chief Bull. Only Jeff Fort survived. This helps to explain how Jeff Fort today is, in fact, the undisputed leader of the BPSN. Peace stones can refer to several things, including engraved rocks, worry stones, or crystals that are believed to promote calmness and peace, or a simple art activity for kids to make painted rocks with peace symbols. Also, keep in mind the peace stone, which was used by Native Americans to give to other tribes when they made peace as a gift. Also, the peace stone represents the pyramid. Even as a teenager, Fort showed real leadership skills. He was a natural-born chief. Interesting, he actually earned the nickname Angel because he was known for settling disputes, even going so far as to creating alliances between rival gangs. COINTELPRO didn't like a Nubian with these kind of skills. He was a threat to national security. Imagine a teenager successfully negotiating peace treaties between street gangs. Keep in mind about the bloody oath to unalive the chiefs and princes on the land. Listen, the Rangers quickly became a serious force in the city, but here's where it gets even more crazier. They were about the fight for black liberation. Sources say that the Rangers were involved in community activism. They were a spin-off the Black Panthers. They even received support from a Presbyterian minister, Rev. John Fry. Mr. Fry seems like he saw a different side to these young men. Mr. John Fry, or should I say Reverend Fry, saw potential in the Rangers. I wonder, did Rev. Fry fry himself up some pork chop after church? Reverend Fry believed they could actually become a positive influence in their community, help them work within the system, and they did until they were infiltrated by COINTELPRO operations. Unbelievably, they received a $1 million federal grant for job skills training. This was a setup so that the government could get in their pockets. Think about that, a street gang receiving $1 million from the government. If you think that wasn't a setup, you're slow. Jeff Fort's whole case file got COINTELPRO written all over it. $1 million was a lot of faith in their ability to change. It really makes you wonder if things could have gone differently, especially considering it was rigged. Keep in mind as well, the COINTELPRO were writing letters to the Peace Stone and the Black Panthers, trying to get them to start a war against each other. They were signing Jesse Jackson's name to it. Can you believe that? But Jeff Fort and Fred Hampton were too clever for them and figured out that it was the government. Jeff Fort was very tight with the old mafia bosses in Chicago, and when you have a relationship with the mafia, you learn some things. What happened later? Listen, this was a time when people were really looking for ways to address social problems, and I guess some people saw the Rangers as a potential solution. Little did they know, they were being set up for the long game by the government. It really raises questions about the impact that $1 million grant might have had. What if things had gone differently? And then there's this incredible detail about Fort being invited to President Nixon's 1969 inauguration ball. He declined. He sent some of his top guys instead. People are saying it was a calculated move, a way of distancing himself from the establishment, or just a reflection of his priorities at the home base. It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the story. After the COINTELPRO ran their tactics and turned the Black Disciples and the P-Stones against each other, the groups met up behind the Sophomore Hotel to get a good old fight in, as you've seen in the movie Warriors. How they used to meet up and fight, that's basically what they were doing, is they rumbled. The police were called. James Alfaro accepted to call and responded, but little did he know when he arrived, a Moorish American P-Stone on the roof named Charles Edward Bay would shoot him dead. This made the feds pay way closer attention the same year Jeff Fort was still invited to the presidential inauguration. You know, these are the type of guys you don't want to turn down unless you want future problems. You have this young man rising to power during a time of immense social change, caught between this world of community activism and this descent into a so-called criminal enterprise, and we're just getting started. Okay, so we've got the Blackstone Rangers as a major force in Chicago. Keep in mind, the killer clowns don't like Nubians getting too militant. The Black Power movement, or Black Liberation movement, emerged in the mid-1960s from the civil rights movement in the United States, reacting against its moderate, mainstream, and incremental tendencies, and representing the demand for more immediate action to counter white supremacy. The Blackstone Rangers became a powerful militant black group in Chicago with Jeff Fort at the helm, but things are about to change dramatically. The $1 million grant from the government was a setup the whole time. All the attention was to put a huge target on their backs. Another major shift comes in 1966, when Eugene Chief Bull Hairston, the original leader of the Rangers, is imprisoned. This becomes a crucial turning point. Jeff Fort takes complete control and renames the gang the Almighty Black P-Stone Nation. And that's when a new and much darker chapter begins, with the government by way of the COINTELPRO wanting them to go away. So, with Chief Bull out of the picture, Fort takes the reins and the Black P-Stones enter a new era, but it seems like this was a turning point towards more serious criminal activity. At this time, the P-Stones are heavily infiltrated by COINTELPRO informants. They started setting them up for the endgame to put a bad jacket on the P-Stones and labeled them as a criminal organization and a gang instead of a tribe. Like we said, one of the very things they fear is so-called black militants. What was behind the shift? Well, it's a complex issue, but it seems that the allure of power and money combined with increasing pressure from law enforcement kind of pushed the Black P-Stones further into the criminal underworld. COINTELPRO were working their hardest to make the P-Stone criminals in the eyes of the public, so that they could later lock them all up or eliminate them completely, which is protocol in the plans. We see a chess move towards more so, called organized crime, robberies, extortion, control of the illegal drug and sex trades in the South Side. All this brought on by informants working for COINTELPRO, doing what they called illegal entries. Also, Jeff Fort did take control of Chicago streets and monitor the criminal world. What we mean by that is, he knew he couldn't stop it completely, so his idea was to control it and keep it from kids. Jeff Fort and his crew beat up drug dealers and pimps. Jeff Fort ran a no-drug policy. They were set up by COINTELPRO, so they could create a pattern that would label them as a gang instead of a tribe. Keep in mind they later used these same tactics in California with Raymond Washington and Tookie Williams. The Crips were becoming a powerful black militant group, so they had to divide and conquer by getting rid of Raymond and Tookie. We got tapes breaking that down in the links in the description. Keep in mind these tribes are at war on the land, and Jeff Fort, Raymond Washington, Tookie Williams and many more were all labeled as outlaw chiefs. Outlaw chiefs are chiefs who wouldn't take a deal with their enemy. They rebel against their conqueror's rules. With Fort becoming a dissident and rebellion against the government, who he felt were criminals, led him down a dangerous road. A dissident is a person who actively challenges an established political or religious system, doctrine, belief, policy, or institution. So Jeff Fort's story is even more complicated than that, especially when you consider that $1 million setup grant they received from the government. That's a big piece of the puzzle. That was a calculated chess move by the government. What happened with that money? Did the government just turn a blind eye? Keep in mind, when they gave Jeff the money, this put the government in their pockets and got them under contract with them. In other words, it put him on a government tracker. Now he would have to give some kind of accountability of where the $1 million went. The FBI killer clowns launched an investigation into the use of those funds on Jeff Fort and the Blackstone Tribe. Jeff Fort was summoned to testify before a Senate committee, and here's where we see that defiant streak in Fort again, right? He basically introduced himself and walked out of the hearing. He was later found guilty of contempt of Congress. What is contempt of Congress? Contempt of Congress is the misdemeanor act of obstructing the work of the United States Congress or one of its committees. Historically, the bribery of a U.S. senator or U.S. representative was considered contempt of Congress. So it almost seems like a deliberate act of rebellion against the government, those who govern the mental. A deliberate act of rebellion is a planned and purposeful action taken to resist authority, challenge norms, or oppose societal expectations, often involving the defiance of rules or power structures. A deliberate act of rebellion is a conscious and intentional choice to disobey or oppose something, rather than an accidental or impulsive action. Such acts are often motivated by a desire for personal freedom, a belief in a different way of doing things, or a challenge to the status quo. Knowingly incited, engaged, or gave aid and comfort to a rebellion or insurrection. The rebellion was against the authority of the United States or its laws. The illegal actions were willful and intentional. Jeff Fort refused to play by the rules of a system that he felt had failed him and his community. It's almost like he was trying to make a statement showing that he wouldn't be controlled by the same forces that, in his view, had oppressed his community for so long. It's a powerful image, him walking out that Senate committee. Jeff people said that there was no misuse of state funds, but yet he didn't know how to manage a payroll either way. Jeff Ford received 5 years from the feds doing this. Then, while he was serving time in Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary, another significant event happens. Fort converts to Islam and takes the name Prince Malik Abdul Ka'bah. The Federal Correctional Institution, Leavenworth, is a medium-security federal prison for male inmates in northeast Kansas. It is operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, a division of the United States Department of Justice. It also includes a satellite federal prison camp for minimum security male offenders. Keep in mind, this federal prison is connected with Fort Leavenworth, which is a United States Army installation located in Leavenworth County, Kansas, in the city of Leavenworth, and is the oldest active United States Army post west of Washington, D.C. Also, Fort Leavenworth Prison, specifically the United States Disciplinary Barracks, USDB, is the U.S. military's only maximum security facility for male service members convicted at court-martial for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, housing those with sentences exceeding 10 years. Fort Leavenworth is the oldest continuously active military installation west of the Mississippi River, established in 1827, and is home to the U.S. Army's Combined Arms Center, CAC, and the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks. So why would Jeff Fort be locked up at a federal military prison? Also keep in mind, they're hiding the records in Kansas underground. At the time you had to be 27 years old to go to this prison, but Jeff Fort was 25. They've been locking up the Mississippian chiefs here for a long time. Fort served 2 years at the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, and was paroled in 1976. When Fort converted to Islam, this got the government real scared and put them edge. The COINTELPRO consider black Muslims as black militant. Black militancy in turn gave rise to the black nationalist and black power movements, intertwined ideologies that encouraged African Americans to take pride in their culture and seize power for themselves, rather than relying on whites and white institutions. This is a major shift, and it has left the government wondering about his motivations. Was it a genuine spiritual awakening, or was there something more strategic going on? That's a question that's still debated today. It was a part of his journey back to his original self. Some people believe it was a sincere spiritual transformation, while others see it as a calculated move to corner the game, maybe to gain influence within the prison system, or as a way to protect his operations from law enforcement and COINTELPRO. It's also worth noting that this was a time when interest in Islam as a religion was growing among the so-called African Americans. You heard of the Nation of Islam in Chicago, right? The Nation of Islam, NOI, is a religious organization founded in the United States by Wallace Fard Muhammad in 1930, and passed to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. A centralized and hierarchical organization, the NOI is committed to black nationalism and focuses its attention on the African diaspora, especially on African Americans. While describing itself as Islamic and using Islamic terminology, its religious tenets differ substantially from orthodox Islamic traditions. Scholars of religion characterize it as a new religious movement. The government have been watching them since the 1930s or earlier. So some people are saying Fort's conversion might have been a way to connect with that movement and expand his base of support. It's interesting how religion played such a complex role in his life. On one hand, he had the support of Reverend Fry in the early days, and then later. He embraces Islam and uses it to shape his own movement. Religion seems to have been both a source of guidance and a tool for Fort, and it's hard to disentangle those two aspects. But one thing is certain, his leadership within the gang continue even from behind bars. Also, the Five Percenters, also known as the Nation of Gods and Earths, NGE, are a loosely organized movement that emerged in the 1960s as an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, with a focus on self-empowerment and a unique interpretation of Islam and black identity. Keep in mind, both of these organizations' root is the Moorish Science Temple of America coming down from noble Drew Ali. So now Fort is leading this increasingly powerful and so-called organized criminal enterprise, bad-jacketed by the government and media. Bad-jacketing is a term for planting doubt on the authenticity of an individual's bona fides or identity. An example would be creating suspicion through spreading false rumors, manufacturing evidence, etc., that falsely portray someone in a community organization as an informant or member of law enforcement or guilty of malfeasance such as skimming organization funds. This was all while Jeff Fort was navigating the complexities of his newfound faith. Now keep in mind, real Muslims don't sell drugs. Jeff Fort didn't smoke or drink. Man, the COINTELPRO guys consider him even more dangerous because of this. Real Muslims are not criminals, you hear me? In fact, Jeff Fort never was into selling drugs. He was a ladies' man. A pretty boy, but he had some hands. He was really intelligent and knew how to talk. They used to beat up drug dealers and pimps. Now listen, all of this happens before the 1970s. The story takes an even more intense turn as we move into that decade. What happens next is that things escalate quickly in the 1970s. Jeff Ford is released from prison and relocates to Milwaukee for a while. Word on the street is that the COINTELPRO boys were going to hit him when he got out. Now here's where Jeff Fort really pissed off the government. Big Mama moved her Rook to Milwaukee. During that time in Milwaukee, he becomes involved with the Moorish Science Temple of America, Unity Temple 3, the Moorish Stronghold 1492. This made the government shake their heads. Now, I don't even got to tell you. One way to get a swift kick right in the crack of your behind by the US government is to go off as a Nubian in America and start talking about the Moors and the Moorish Science Temple. Noble Drew Ali, Jeff Fort, and the master teacher Dr. Malachi Z. York El are all victims of this hate. Now, you can call yourself Christians, Muslims, or Jews. You can even be Bloods, Crips, but don't go off attaching yourself to your natural birthrights connecting you to this land. That's a threat to national security. National security encompasses the protection of a nation's citizens, economy, and institutions from various threats, both domestically and internationally, including military, economic, social, and environmental factors. Now, why would Nubians in America claiming their birthright be a threat to national security? Who are the Nubians in America? There's something about that just really makes these guys mad. I mean, they rock your crowns, fezzes or turbans in their temples like they know about the mounds. Man, let me tell you, when you go off to put your crown back on, you better make sure you're a high-powered alchemist, because the killer clowns is just what it sounds like. They are the COINTELPRO, and their job is to protect the North Gate. They have piles and piles of files and research on the Moors in their library. I wouldn't be surprised if they know more than the Moors about the Moors, you heard me. These guys are very thorough when it comes to keeping the Nubians in America asleep. Keep in mind, Jeff Fort was 25 inside of Leavenworth. At the time, you had to be 27 years old to go to Leavenworth. Fort was in for fraud, which is really inappropriate. He shouldn't have been in there technically because he was doing a fraud sentence. That prison there was for like the kidnappers, hijackers, old school mafia gangsters and hitmen. Like we said, the age limit was 27. He didn't even have a violent crime, so maybe they were hoping that Jeff wouldn't survive or he would get his manhood took. In Leavenworth, Jeff ran into two Moors, Cadillac Bay and Nathan E.L., who opened the gate to the Moor science for Jeff Fort. Nathan L. recalled Jeff approaching them, asking them to teach him. Cadillac Bay and Nathan El said they had just recently taken over the prison temple from some elderly St. Louis Moors by stabbing the chief security and the head chairman. They then took all the literature because they weren't running the temple right and had sold them out to prison officials and wasn't teaching more science anymore. Plus, they start disrespecting the Prophet Noble Drew Ali. For those who don't know, the Nation of Islam grew out of the Moorish science temple. Fort was studying under a guy named Ralph Walker E.L., who was the one that basically taught him the basic lessons. The Moors said Jeff Fort was really significant because a brother got killed up in Chicago during their convention in 1974, and Jeff Fort sent his soldiers up in there to protect the Sister Christina Price Bay and the Moors that were up there running the Grand Temple. This is how he got his nationality card and tribal name, the El Ruken. Ralph Walker E.L. was the one who basically taught Jeff Fort his basic lessons about the Moor science. Nathan E.L. also goes on to tell how he and other Moors were selling men to other men in prison, which made Jeff Fort look at them funny. Now here's where things get interesting. After years of laying low in Wisconsin, Jeff Fort missed his old life. He moved back to Chicago to lead his old brothers, and upon his return to Chicago in 1978, he completely rebrands the Black Peace Stones. He changes the name to the Ruken Tribe of the Moorish Science Temple. Ruken meaning the pillar or cornerstone in Arabic, another transformation. Words of doubt were in the air. A vast majority of the organization rejected the idea. This is when the Great Split happens. The Stones led by Chief Bull and the El Ruken led by Jeff Fort. The El Ruken had to follow strict rules of no pork, no drinking or smoking, no using foul language, no drugs. Keep in mind, Jeff Fort is Big Mama's Rook on this chessboard. It seems Jeff Fort was constantly adapting, almost like a chameleon, changing colors to fit his surroundings. Or was he awakened to his true birthright and history on the land and was a reincarnated prince and chief on the land? This shift ultimately got Jeff Fort 168 years in prison. The killer clowns couldn't let him continue after he gained the knowledge that he was El Ruken, a chief, and that he was Big Mama's Red Rook. Some people working with the government speculate that adopting this new religious identity was a tactic to avoid law enforcement and surveillance by the FBI, COINTELPRO, who had already been keeping a very close eye on the Black Peace Stones for years. But this couldn't be true because joining with the Moorish Science Temple brought more heat on them than ever before. Keep in mind, Moorish science is not a religion, technically, it's a way of life. Islam's civics, not to be confused with Islam, the religion created in the 600 AD by Muhammad. Some people thought Jeff Fort's move might have been a way to operate under the radar, claiming religious freedom, nationality and birthrights as a shield for their activities, which was coerced and brought on by the COINTELPRO. They planted drugs and guns in all the El Ruken's cars, houses and offices who they wanted to take down. Some thought Jeff Fort was using it as a clever strategy, if that was indeed the intention. It makes sense, and I know that the El Ruken weren't about street crime. They were now about birthrights and nationality. This was a major threat to US national security. The government liked it better when there were savages, gangbangers, criminals, and just called themselves Peace Stones. The government feared their operation. It became much more elaborate. The El Ruken with Jeff Fort at the head were heavily involved in trying to overthrow the government by giving Nubians in America, especially Chicago, their birthrights back. The COINTELPRO had to infiltrate them fast so that they could eliminate them off the streets. They used informants to start illegal entries so that they could build a case against Jeff Fort. The informant's jobs was to join the Peace Stone, now being called the El Ruken Moors. Once they were inside, then from that point, to start drug trafficking, especially heroin and cocaine. The informants, who now claimed to be El Ruken but were secretly working for the government, moved beyond the streets and established connections with international cartels, becoming a major player in the drug trade, which they already had from the CIA, lining the El Ruken right up for the takedown. They were able to later set Jeff Fort up with false drug charges, locking him up in the early 1980s. The government plans were to never let Jeff Fort, aka El Ruken, Chief Angel Malik Bey, Big Mama's Rook, out of prison, meaning back on the chessboard. They say Fort continued to run the El Ruken from a federal prison. That's funny, right? But anyway, the government say he was essentially running a so-called criminal empire from behind bars. You see, this is where Jeff Fort got set up at. While he's in prison, he's blind to the streets, really. He only knew what they were telling him. The government used this to make sure he would never get out. They used more informants to load down their criminal files. Man, at the time, anyone who got arrested with big dope in Chicago was attached to the El Rukns and Jeff Fort by the government, even if they never even heard of the El Rukns. Some guys were getting off just if they say they were a part of the El Rukn or they got dope from them. The COINTELPRO was pulling out all stops. Some people are saying, how is that even possible to run a so-called gang from a government federal prison? Not to mention, this guy is watched 24 hours a day by military intelligence. Well, they say through a combination of loyal lieutenants and a seemingly endless stream of phone calls, which was being recorded and looked over with a magnifying glass right after he hung up by the government. Keep in mind, Fort was a natural-born chief, and he had an incredible ability to inspire loyalty and obedience. He was charismatic, a gifted speaker, but he was also ruthless in dealing with anyone who betrayed him and his enemies. This dude was 4'9", some say 5'9", and had 5,000 men following him. It's both fascinating and terrifying to think about him wielding that much power at 4'9" from within a prison cell. Then, of course, there are the allegations of terrorism. Terrorism, in its broadest sense, is the use of violence against non-combatants to achieve political or ideological aims. The term is used in this regard primarily to refer to intentional violence during peacetime or in the context of war against non-combatants. There are various different definitions of terrorism with no universal agreement about it. Different definitions of terrorism emphasize its randomness, its aim to instill fear, and its broader impact beyond its immediate victims. This is a high-power tactic used by the US government so they could give you over 100 years in prison. The terrorism tactic is used to paint you as a real threat to American society. American society is a complex and diverse entity characterized by Western cultural influences, a history of immigration, and a focus on values like independence, equal opportunity, and achievement. They consider Jeff Fort as a combatant. Combatant is the legal status of a person entitled to directly participate in hostilities during an armed conflict and may be intentionally targeted by an adverse party for their participation in the armed conflict. This was so they could justify when they take you down in the public's eyes. They promote misinformation and disinformation to the public about you, which take this story to a whole other level. This is when things take a truly shocking turn. In the mid-1980s, while Fort was serving time in Texas, the COINTELPRO set up a plot involving the El Rukn and the Libyan government, Mohammed Gaddafi. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was a Libyan revolutionary, politician and political theorist who ruled Libya as a dictator in 1969. Keep in mind, they later took him out as well. He was assassinated by paid rebel forces of the National Liberation Army in 2011. The government allegedly paid for one of Fort's top generals to fly over to Libya to meet with the Libyan government official. Now, why would the government do that? This was a part of the setup to tie the El Rukn in with a foreign government so they could label them as a terrorist group. A terrorist group is an organization that uses violence, threats, and intimidation to achieve political, religious, or ideological goals, often targeting civilians to instill fear and coerce governments or populations. It's the oldest trick in the book. This is where it starts to feel like something out of a spy thriller. The plot was to set up Fort to look like he had, through various intermediaries, struck a deal with Libyan officials. Jeff Fort didn't know anything about this. You mean to tell me Jeff Fort made a deal with a foreign government from inside a federal prison? That's funny. This got COINTELPRO written all over it. They set them up to make it look like they were going to carry out terrorist attacks on US soil in exchange for money and weapons from Mohammed Gaddafi. They planted a rocket launcher in one of the El Rukn office and used it as key evidence. When the killer clowns unleashed the propaganda through the media to the public, they bought right into the storyline. Wow, it was a shocking scheme, and it sent shockwaves through the country. Once the killer clowns had Jeff Fort labeled in the public eyes as a terrorist, this was all they needed to justify giving him 168 years. You see, the killer clowns are alchemists. They know they need the public to agree that you're a bad guy in order for them to take you down. What kind of attacks were they planning? The details are still classified. Why is it still classified? It's because they made it up. They weren't planning a terrorist attack. That's cap. Listen, Nubians in America are not into terrorism, maybe selling drugs or smoking a couple guys for messing with their money or their family, but they're not into terrorist acts. Okay, but The FBI believes they were considering targets like government buildings, airports, and maybe even the White House. All crap, so they could railroad a man they were scared of. This was during the height of the Cold War, remember? The Cold War was a decades-long struggle for global influence and supremacy between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the US government used science as a tool in psychological warfare and propaganda campaigns against the black militant groups, including international conferences, cultural exchange programs, educational projects, and CIA backing of scientific and cultural organizations. This was a time of extreme tension between the US and Libya as well. Jeff Fort went from a local street thug to an alleged international terrorist in the eyes of the public overnight. Let the killer clowns tell it. They made him into a criminal mastermind on a world level. It's almost too incredible to believe what happened next. This was a major plot and scandal against Jeff Fort and several of his people. They all were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit terrorism, and this is where it all comes crashing down. They all got a lengthy sentence. This a tragic end to a story that started with so much potential. Jeff Fort was a victim of COINTELPRO operations. It's a cautionary tale about the allure of power, the control, nature of violence, and the devastating consequences of choosing the path to reclaiming his birthright. Fort was convicted in 1987 and sentenced to 80 years in prison for his role in the so-called Libyan plot, which he had nothing to do with, which was added to his existing drug trafficking sentence, which they had already set him up with. A few years later, he was set up and convicted of ordering the 1981 murder of a rival gang leader, which he didn't do, and given another 75 years. Keep in mind, this man is in jail. The whole time he's supposedly doing all this, and not just in any jail. He in federal prison after being convicted of being a terrorist, and people still buying this story. Wow, there is just no common sense left these days. 168 years in prison, they just should have said life. The angel, who once mediated peace on the streets of Chicago, ends up being made to be one of the most notorious criminals in the eyes of American history. It's a stark contrast. A reminder that when you put on that fezzes or turbans as a Nubian in America and got influence, you better be ready for war with the killer clowns. Fort starts with good intentions and always had good intention. It just when you are fighting with the devil, he doesn't play by the rules. There's no tell what you may have to do to survive.